It was 7:42 in the morning, August 17th, 1943. Technical Sergeant James McKenna was crouched under the wing of a P-38 Lightning at WWII airfield in New Guinea. He watched his pilot, Lieutenant Robert Hayes, get ready for a mission that, in his gut, he believed the young man would not survive. Hayes was only 23, with 6 combat sorties behind him and not a single enemy aircraft to his name. The Japanese had sent 18 Mitsubishi Zero fighters to intercept the routine morning patrol. Hayes and his P-38 would be flying straight into them. McKenna had been looking after Lightnings in this theater for 8 months. He knew every panel, every cable, every quirk. Twin engines, twin booms, great top speed, and a monster at high altitude. There was, however, one deadly weakness that was killing American pilots almost every day. The Lightning simply could not turn with the Zero. The Japanese fighter was lighter, more nimble, and could complete a full flat turn in about half the time a P-38 needed. In a close-range dogfight, that gap was the difference between life and death. American tactical doctrine was crystal clear. P-38 pilots were told never to try to circle with a Zero. They were supposed to exploit speed and altitude. Dive from above, fire one pass, then climb away. Hit and run, don't get sucked into a turning contest. Hayes had tried to follow that doctrine on 5 different missions. It hadn't produced results. The Japanese aces understood Lightning tactics and used that knowledge against them. They lured American pilots into turning engagements, tightened their own turn radius, slid inside, got on the American tail, and shot them down. The 5th Air Force had lost 37 P-38s in 6 weeks. Most died after getting trapped in horizontal fights they couldn't break away from. McKenna had watched too many young men go that way. Confident kids walked out to their aircraft in the morning and either came back in coffins or didn't come back at all. The training manuals blamed pilot error. Instructors insisted these losses happened because men ignored doctrine. McKenna didn't accept that explanation. For him, the real culprit was hidden in the flight controls. On the P-38, the aileron cables ran back through the twin booms to the tail, then forward around pulleys to the wing control surfaces.
Ow.
The system was built with a small amount of play. Not much, maybe 3/8 of an inch when the stick was fully deflected. But that small amount of slack introduced a slight delay between the pilot moving the control column and the ailerons actually responding. At high speed, this lag was almost unnoticeable. But at lower speeds, in hard banking turns where timing meant everything, that fraction of a second became the difference between rolling into a 0S turn and rolling just late enough to get riddled with cannon fire. McKenna had raised this worry with the engineering officer 2 months earlier. The officer checked the numbers and said the cable tension was within the approved range.
Factory tolerances allowed that much play?
Changing it would put the airplane outside the manufacturer's specifications? In any case, line mechanics had no authority to alter flight control systems. Any change would require a formal engineering modification from Lockheed, far away in California. So McKenna did something he knew violated almost every line in the Army Air Force's maintenance regulations. He took a length of piano wire from a damaged aircraft, cut a 6-inch segment, bent it into a Z. The first Lightning pilot McKenna had lost to a Zero was Lieutenant David Chen. That was on July 9th, 1943. Chen had been in theater only 3 weeks. McKenna had worked on his aircraft every morning, and they often talked about California. Chen was from Sacramento, McKenna from Long Beach. Both had turned wrenches on cars before the war. On that day, Chen took off just after sunrise on a fighter sweep over Leh. 2 hours later, he returned with 3 bullet holes clustered in his left boom, and a story about how a Zero had slipped inside his turn. He said he had tried to roll out and dive away exactly as doctrine instructed, but the Lightning seemed to lag behind his control inputs, like there was a hesitation between his hand and the airplane's roll. The Zero nearly killed him. Only his wingman's timely fire saved him. McKenna examined the damage. The bullet holes were grouped tightly, textbook deflection shooting. That precision should have been impossible if Chen's aircraft had rolled instantly and dived away as soon as he commanded it, unless there had been a slight delay, just enough for the Zero pilot to track and lead him perfectly. Chen's P-38 went to the depot for repairs, and McKenna never saw it again. 3 weeks later, he heard that Chen had been killed flying another Lightning over Rabaul, same pattern. Cooked into a turn, unable to roll out quickly enough, shot down. The next loss was Captain William Morrison. Morrison was an experienced flight leader with 11 victories. He knew the lightning, its strengths and weaknesses, and flew with discipline. On August 3rd, his flight intercepted 8 Zeros at 12,000 feet over Oro Bay. Morrison downed 1 Zero on the first pass, then repositioned for another attack. 2 enemy fighters reversed toward him. McKenna later heard recordings of the radio traffic. Morrison tried to roll inverted and execute a splitus to escape, and radioed that his controls felt mushy. The Zero stayed glued to him through the maneuver and shot him down at 4,000 feet. His wingman reported that Morrison's P-38 seemed slow to respond, like he was wrestling the controls rather than the airplane following instantly. Morrison didn't survive the crash. His crew chief Rodriguez from Texas was a close friend of McKenna's, convinced the aircraft itself had failed. Rodriguez checked everything after the wreckage was recovered. He verified engine settings, control rigging, cable tensions. Everything met specifications. The official conclusion was pilot error. Rodriguez didn't buy it, and neither did McKenna. By mid-August, McKenna had watched 17 pilots die. Some he knew well, others he had only met briefly during pre-flight checks, but he had signed off on the maintenance of every one of their aircraft. He had stood on the flight line watching them taxi out and take off. Some came back. Many did not. The survivors described the same sensation. In tight maneuvering, the P-38 felt sluggish, as though there was a slight hesitation between moving the stick and the airplane reacting. Most pilots assumed this was simply the nature of a heavy twin-engine fighter. A little lag seemed normal. But McKenna knew that was not how a control system was supposed to behave. He had felt the slack in the cables with his own hands. He began listening to the sound the cables made when you tensioned them. When he plucked them, they produced a particular low twang. Cables with more play gave a different tone than tightly tensioned ones. To his ear, every lightning on the ramp sounded slightly loose, still within spec, but not truly tight. One evening after Morrison's death, he mentioned this to Rodriguez. Rodriguez asked what they could do. McKenna answered that officially, nothing could be changed. But unofficially, there might be a way, though it would mean breaking rules that could get them thrown in front of a court-martial. The core issue wasn't ignorance. American pilots knew the correct tactics. Briefings hammered the same points. Training flights reinforced them. Never try to circle with a zero. Use altitude and speed. Make one pass and disengage. Instructions were clear. The problem was that real combat never followed the neat patterns of a training syllabus. Lieutenant Robert Hayes had been in New Guinea for 2 months. A 23-year-old farm boy from Iowa, he had flown 6 combat missions and scored no kills. Not because he lacked skill, but because his strict adherence to doctrine kept him from getting shots. On his 3rd mission, he dived from high altitude onto a zero, built his speed to 400 miles per hour, approached out of the sun just as the manual recommended, and started to pull lead for a deflection shot. The zero suddenly snap-rolled to the left and plunged away. Hayes tried to match the move. His P-38 rolled into the turn but felt as if it were pushing through thick mud. By the time the nose pointed where he wanted it, the zero had vanished. He pulled out and climbed back to his assigned altitude without firing a single round. The 4th mission was even worse. Hayes and his wingman surprised 2 zeros at 15,000 feet. Hayes fired first, but missed. The enemy fighter reversed hard to the right. As Hayes rolled to follow, his wingman shouted a warning. 2 more zeros were diving down from above. Hayes tried to roll level and dive away. The lightning responded, but not with the urgency he needed. Its sluggish movement gave one of the diving zeros enough time to deliver a 3-second burst into Hayes' right. Boom. The 20mm shells didn't hit anything vital, but the impact and flashes were enough to convince Hayes to break off and run for home, both engines smoking. On his 5th mission, Hayes watched his closest friend die. His wingman, Lieutenant Thomas Parker from Boston, was just 21. They had gone through training together. On August 14th over Finchofen, Parker became separated from the formation in a confused dogfight. 2 zeros latched onto his tail. Parker tried every defensive move he knew. He rolled aggressively, reversed, tried scissors. The zeros matched him through every maneuver. Hayes heard Parker's voice on the radio pleading for help, the fear rising in his voice, and Parker reported that his aircraft would not turn quickly enough. Then there was gunfire, a scream, and silence. That night, Hayes did not sleep. Most of the squadron lay awake as well. Parker's bunk stayed empty. His few belongings were boxed and tagged for shipment home. His P-38 was listed as a combat loss. The maintenance record noted no mechanical fault. The official explanation, again, was pilot error during defensive maneuvering. McKenna had worked on Parker's fighter that very morning. Everything had been flawless. Timing, rigging, cable tension, all fell inside the allowed range. The airplane was fine. Parker was dead anyway. McKenna knew the real reason. That tiny delay in the controls, the slight slack that the manual said was acceptable, had killed Parker just as it had killed others. What haunted McKenna most was the smell. Every morning the maintenance area was thick with the scent of aviation gasoline, hot metal, and hydraulic fluid. That was the smell of aircraft being readied for battle. Some would return, some would not. And McKenna would be there again the next day, breathing the same fumes, turning wrenches on more P-38s, watching more young men walk toward aircraft that could not quite respond quickly enough to save them. On the night of August 16th, Hayes came to the maintenance dispersal and found McKenna working on his Lightning. He asked if there was anything at all, that could make the airplane roll faster. He said he no longer cared whether it was authorized or not. He just wanted a chance to live. McKenna saw the fear and desperation in his eyes. He saw a kid who understood that if nothing changed, he would probably be dead within weeks. McKenna told him to come back in the morning. He would see what he could do. That night, McKenna worked alone. After 11 p.m., the hangar was mostly silent. The only sounds were the distant hum of generators and insects battering themselves against the overhead lights. He had a segment of piano wire from a Lightning that had ground looped 2 weeks earlier. The aircraft had been written off, but McKenna had scavenged useful odds and ends before it went to the scrap pile, including a short length of hardened wire from the rudder trim mechanism. He'd kept it in his tool bag without knowing exactly why. Now he did. Sitting on the hangar floor with the wire and a pair of pliers, he bent it carefully into a Z shape. The wire was stiff and resisted. His hand slipped, and on the second attempt, he sliced his thumb. Blood made the metal slippery. He wiped it on his coveralls and kept working. After about 8 minutes, he had the shape he wanted. That simple bend would act as an inline tension device, adding just enough preload to pull the slack out of the system. Installing it was more difficult. The inside of the boom was cramped. McKenna had to work with one hand while holding a flashlight with the other, the trembling beam throwing shifting shadows. His shoulder pressed against the internal structure, the edge of the opening cutting into his arm. Sweat ran down his back. He disconnected the cable at a pulley junction and fumbled with the tiny clevis pin. It slipped from his fingers and clattered away into the boom. He spent 5 minutes groping in the dark until he found it again. All the while, his heart pounded. If the engineering officer caught him altering a flight control linkage with an unapproved piece of scrap metal, he could be court-martialed, maybe even thrown in prison. But he was convinced that if he did nothing, Hayes would die soon anyway. He inserted the piano wire between the cable end and the pulley and forced the clevis pin through the tight fit. When it finally seated, he pulled on the cable to test it. There was no slack. The aileron moved as soon as he applied force. Satisfied, he replaced the inspection panel, gathered his tools, wiped as much blood and grease away as he could, and walked out of the hangar at about 1:15 in the morning. He had just altered a flight control system without authorization. If something went wrong in the air and Hayes crashed, the responsibility would be his. But if the modification worked, Hayes might finally have a fighting chance. McKenna lay in his bunk, but did not sleep. He stared at the ceiling until dawn. At 6:30, he went back to the flight line, watched the crew fuel and arm Hayes' Lightning, and watched Hayes climb into the cockpit. At 7:42, Hayes took off. McKenna watched the P-38 lift into the sky, join up with 16 other fighters, and turn northwest toward Japanese-held territory. All he could do then was wait. The air battle began at 8:14. Hayes' four-ship element intercepted a formation of Zeros at 13,000 feet over the Huon Gulf. The morning sun was behind the Americans. It was a textbook setup. Hayes flew in the 3rd position. When his leader called the bounce, they rolled in together. Hayes picked a Zero at the rear of the enemy formation and dove. His Lightning accelerated to about 380 miles per hour. The Japanese fighter grew larger in his gun sight. He could make out the painted rising sun insignia and even the dark shape of the pilot's helmet. He squeezed the trigger. The 450 caliber guns and single 20mm cannon in the nose roared. Most shots missed, but a few stitched along the Zero's wing. It wasn't enough. The Zero snapped right and dived. Hayes rolled to follow, and that was the instant he felt the difference. The Lightning responded at once. No spongy lag, no sluggish hesitation. The stick moved, and the aircraft rolled with it, as if it were an extension of his arm. He banked 90 degrees in what felt like half the usual time, and dropped the nose. The Zero remained squarely in his sight. He fired again, holding the trigger for a brief burst. The rounds climbed up the Japanese fighter from tail to cockpit. The engine erupted, and pieces of metal flew off. The Zero rolled inverted and spiraled toward the jungle below, trailing black smoke. It was Hayes's first kill, but there was no time to savor it. His wingmen shouted a warning. More Zeros were diving from above. Hayes looked up and saw 3 of them coming down fast. They had watched him destroy their comrade and were coming for revenge. Hayes shoved the throttles forward and started to climb, but the Zeros had the speed advantage in the dive. They would be on him within seconds. With no room to run, Hayes knew his only choice was to turn and fight. Every instinct, every drill, every word from the briefing officers screamed at him to keep climbing, to save his energy and get away. The old doctrine felt like a guaranteed death sentence, so he slammed the stick over and pulled hard. The P-38 Lightning snapped into the turn like a completely different airplane. The nose whipped across the horizon, and there it was, the lead Zero. The Japanese pilot, trying to follow, was caught completely off guard by the rapid reversal. Suddenly exposed at a terrible angle, Hayes pulled lead and opened fire. His burst of cannon shells tore into the Zero's wing root, and the entire wing just folded up. The enemy fighter tumbled apart in the sky. That was his second kill in about 30 seconds. The last 2 Zeros didn't back down. They tried to force him into an overshoot, using a scissors maneuver, weaving back and forth with hard turns to throw off his aim, but Hayes stayed right with them. Every single time they changed direction, his P-38 rolled instantly into the new bank. The aircraft wasn't lagging or fighting him anymore. It did exactly what he wanted, the very moment he asked it to. It felt as if invisible weights had been stripped from the control system. Then, one of the Zeros made a fatal mistake. It reversed too sharply, bleeding off too much airspeed. Hayes slipped right inside its turn, closing to a mere 60 meters. He fired. At that range, he couldn't miss. The Japanese fighter disintegrated, and pieces of debris slammed into Hayes's right, boom, rattling the Lightning. That was his third victory. The last Zero broke off and fled for its life. Hayes didn't give chase. His fuel and ammunition were both running low. He climbed back to altitude, rejoined the survivors of his flight, and set a course for home. The entire dogfight had lasted maybe 7 minutes. When Hayes touched down back at WWII at 9:03 a.m., Sergeant McKenna was waiting for him right there on the flight line. Hayes shut down his engines, climbed out of the cockpit, his hands trembling, his flight suit drenched in sweat. He walked straight over to McKenna and said just 2 words. It worked. What neither of them knew yet was that 6 other American pilots had watched the whole thing unfold from a higher altitude. Captain Frank Mitchell, a flight leader with the 475th Fighter Group, had been circling at 15,000 feet when he saw Hayes' S element get tangled up with the Zeros below. But he noticed something strange. Hayes' Lightning was rolling faster than any P-38 Mitchell had ever seen. The aircraft snapped through reversals as if it weighed half its actual mass. Mitchell knew pretty much every pilot in the theater and had a good sense of their skills. Hayes was a competent pilot for sure, but he wasn't superhuman. The difference had to be the machine. After landing, Mitchell found Hayes in the debriefing room. Hayes, still riding the adrenaline, was struggling to write his combat report, which now listed 3 confirmed kills. Mitchell asked him what had changed. Hayes said he wasn't sure, only that his plane had responded better, quicker than ever before. Mitchell then asked if maintenance had done anything unusual to the aircraft. Hayes told him to go talk to Technical Sergeant McKenna. A couple of hours later, Mitchell found McKenna in the maintenance area. He was working on another Lightning, his hands black with grease, his coveralls stained with hydraulic fluid. Mitchell got straight to the point. He asked McKenna what he had done to Hayes' fighter. McKenna hesitated for a moment, then explained the whole thing. the piano wire device. The added tension, the completely unapproved change to the control system. Mitchell listened patiently until he was finished, and then asked if the same modification could be done to his own P-38. McKenna agreed, but he warned him of the risks. The change wasn't approved or tested formally. If something failed, they could both face serious charges, maybe even a court-martial. Said he didn't care. He'd lost 4 pilots from his flight in the last month, all of them trapped in turns they couldn't escape. If there was even a small chance to keep more of his men alive, he wanted it. Regulations could wait. That evening, McKenna installed the same wire tensioner in Mitchell's P-38. Mitchell flew it the next morning and came back ecstatic. The Lightning, he said, rolled like a real fighter instead of a lumbering truck. His wingman heard the story and immediately asked for the same modification. By August 20th, McKenna had modified 9 aircraft. Word spread like wildfire through the squadron. Pilots started quietly asking their crew chiefs if they'd heard about the cable fix. Some chiefs refused, not willing to break the rules. But others, seeing the results, were willing to take the risk. McKenna showed them how to cut the piano wire, bend it into that simple Z shape, and install it in line with the aileron cable. The whole process took about 8 minutes, and it completely transformed the P-38's handling. The modification spread from unit to unit, not through official orders, but through quiet conversations in ready rooms and hushed words under the wings of planes on the flight line. There were no directives, no technical orders, nothing on paper at all. It was a ghost modification, a secret weapon, hidden in plain sight. Hayes shot down 2 more Zeros on August 22nd with his improved controls. Captain Mitchell claimed 3 on August 25th. Soon, other pilots began returning from missions with new kills chalked up on their fuselages. The statistics began to tell the story. In July, Lightning units in the Southwest Pacific had been losing roughly 2 P-38s for every Zero they destroyed. By August, the ratio had improved to about 1.3 to 1. By September, it was nearly even. Something had clearly changed, but officially, no one could say what it was. The Japanese were the first to notice from the wrong side of the gun sight. Fighter reports from their 11th Air Fleet at the end of August started mentioning that American P-38s were maneuvering more aggressively, rolling into turns much faster, and reversing direction with shocking speed. Tactics that had worked for months were suddenly, inexplicably failing. The legendary Japanese ace, Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai, a man with 64 victories to his name, countered one of these new P-38s over WWII on September 3rd, 1943. He used a familiar tactic, luring the American into a turning fight waiting for that predictable moment when the big Lightning would begin its slow roll, then snapping his own Zero in the opposite direction to cut inside its path. He had timed this move perfectly countless times. But this time, the P-38 reversed right with him. Sakai knew, almost to the second, how long a Lightning should take to roll. This one moved faster than it had any right to. He barely avoided a mid-air collision and suddenly found the American on his tail, guns ready. In shock, he had no choice but to dive away. Other experienced Zero pilots reported similar encounters. The Americans were flying the same general tactics, but their airplanes were responding just that little bit quicker. That tiny change was enough to disrupt all the carefully learned timing the Japanese pilots relied on to exploit the Lightning's biggest weakness. Japanese technical officers were baffled. They desperately tried to figure out what had changed, examined the wreckage of downed P-38s but found no obvious alterations. The engines looked identical. Weapons were the same. Nothing on the outside of the plane hinted at any modification. What they couldn't see was a simple secret. Hidden deep inside the booms, a short piece of piano wire that looked like it was supposed to be there. Even if they had spotted it, they might not have understood its purpose. It wasn't a new weapon or a more powerful engine. It was nothing more than a subtle change to the tension in the control cables. Yet that subtle, 8-minute fix was costing them their best pilots. By mid-September, Japanese units facing P-38s were losing aircraft at rates they had unseen since the chaotic early months of the war. The psychological effect was devastating. For 2 years, Zero pilots had owned the turning fight, confident they could outmaneuver any American fighter. That confidence began to crack. Pilots who once pressed their attacks without a second thought now became cautious, unsure if their old tricks would still work. Some tried to adapt, avoiding turning fights with P-38s altogether, resorting to hit-and-run tactics of their own. But in doing so, they gave up their greatest advantage. The Zero's soul was its maneuverability. When they tried to fight like the Americans, they found themselves at a severe disadvantage. P-38 was faster, carried heavier armament, and could absorb far more punishment. Other Japanese pilots tried to compensate with sheer aggression, closing to shorter ranges and taking bigger risks. But without that clear edge in a turning fight, that aggression often just led to quicker deaths. Several veteran Zero pilots were killed in September using maneuvers that had worked flawlessly just a few weeks earlier in July. The fundamental problem for the Japanese was that they were reacting to a change they could unsee or measure. You can't develop new tactics to fight a modification when you don't even know it exists. By the end of September, the 11th Air Fleet had lost 38 fighters in combat with P-38s. In that same period, American Lightning losses totaled just 22, for the very first time in the Pacific War. P-38s were shooting down Zeros at a better than 1-to-1 ratio, thanks to one sergeant's unauthorized, brilliant, and dirt-simple idea. The Japanese High Command was forced to issue a new directive. Do not engage the P-38 Lightning unless you have a clear numerical advantage. This was a quiet, yet monumental turning point in the Pacific Air War. The legendary Zero, once the undisputed king of the dogfight, was now frequently the hunted, and a huge part of that dramatic shift can be traced back to a simple 6-inch strip of wire that was never, ever supposed to be there. This ingenious modification never received any formal approval during the war. In fact, the Army Air Force's Engineering Command only found out about it in October 1943. An inspector at the WWII airfield in New Guinea was running routine checks when he noticed strange inconsistencies in the measured cable tensions of the P-38s. Puzzled, he investigated further and discovered the hidden wire inserts. He wrote a report detailing the unauthorized field change and sent it up the chain of command. That document landed on desks and just sat there for weeks. Officers were in a bind. On one hand, the change clearly violated regulations. It was a textbook case of unauthorized modification to a critical flight system. But on the other hand, the data was undeniable. Units that had implemented this secret fix were showing dramatically better kill ratios and, more importantly, much higher survival rates for their pilots. The question wasn't whether the modification worked; it clearly did. The real dilemma was whether the service should punish the men who'd installed it without permission, or just quietly endorse it after the fact. Finally, in November, the aircraft's manufacturer, Lockheed, sent an engineering team to New Guinea to evaluate this field fix for themselves. They were thorough. They measured the cable loads, calculated the stress on the airframe, examined all the structural implications, and even conducted flight tests. Their conclusion was blunt and straightforward. The modification was not only safe and effective, but it should have been part of the original design from the very beginning. Following this report, Lockheed officially incorporated a proper tensioning device into the new P-38J model, which started rolling off the production lines in December 1943. The official engineering paperwork, of course, credited this improvement to formal analysis and design work. The name of the sergeant who had actually come up with the idea, James McKenna, was nowhere to be found. But the pilots knew. Lieutenant Rex Hayes, one of the first to benefit from McKenna's fix, survived the war. He flew a staggering 63 combat missions, shot down 11 enemy aircraft, and returned home to Iowa in 1945. He married his high school sweetheart, raised a family of 4, and spent the next 37 years flying as a crop duster. He never forgot what Sergeant McKenna did for him. Every single year on August 17th, the day his plane was modified, he would call the sergeant to thank him for saving his life. Major Tommy Mitchell, the squadron commander who approved the risky modification, also made it through the war. He became a decorated ace, ending the conflict with 16 victories. He chose to stay in the Air Force, eventually retiring as a colonel in 1963, and for the rest of his career. To every young maintenance officer he mentored, he told the story of McKenna's unauthorized fix. Made sure they understood a crucial lesson. Sometimes the best, most life-saving solutions don't come from a team of engineers with slide rules, but from enlisted mechanics on the flight line, the ones who see things the designers in their offices might overlook. And what about McKenna? the man at the center of it all? He remained in the Army Air Forces until 1946, then returned to his home in California. He went right back to what he knew best, working on engines. He opened his own auto repair garage in Long Beach in 1948 and spent the next 42 years fixing cars. He did it quietly, without ever boasting about his wartime experiences. If anyone asked what he did in the war, he'd just say he was a mechanic and he fixed airplanes. Nothing more. His story might have been lost to history forever, if not for a curious military historian in 1991 while studying P-38 modifications. This historian stumbled upon cryptic references to a piano wire cable fix in old maintenance records from New Guinea. Intrigued, he began digging, tracing veteran lists until he finally found McKenna, now 73 years old but still working part-time in his shop. McKenna confirmed the entire story, but was incredibly humble about it. He insisted it was nothing special, just a job that needed to be done. The historian, however, did the math. Based on the dramatically improved survival rates in the units that used McKenna's fix, he estimated that this simple 6-inch piece of wire may have saved the lives of between 80 and 100 American pilots. When told this, McKenna said he'd never tried to count. He only remembered the faces of the men who came home. Pilots like Hayes, Mitchell, Watkins, all the others whose names were written in logbooks and forever etched in his memory. For him, that was more than enough. James McKenna passed away in 2006 at the age of 88. It didn't say that he had fundamentally changed how a premier American fighter plane flew, or that he had knowingly broken regulations to keep his pilots alive. His old garage in Long Beach is still standing, though it's under new ownership now. But if you were to go into the back office, you'd find a faded photograph hanging on the wall. It shows a young mechanic in greasy coveralls, standing proudly beside a P-38 Lightning. On the back, in faded ink, is a scribbled date, August 1943, New Guinea. This right here is how innovation so often happens in the crucible of war. It doesn't always come from committees, formal channels, or top-down directives. More often, it comes from the sergeants and the mechanics. The people on the ground who recognize a lethal flaw, improvise a brilliant solution, and have the courage to act without waiting for permission when lives are hanging in the balance. It's a powerful reminder that heroes don't always carry guns. Sometimes they carry a wrench. Thanks for watching. If you found this story as incredible as I did, please consider liking the video and subscribing to our channel for more hidden histories like this one. We'll see you in the next video.